Hello everyone and welcome to another Philosophies and Philosophers. What do they know? Do they know things? Let's find out. Today I'm going to be doing on Jared Diamond, the author of Guns, Germs and Steel, a short history of everything from the last 13,000 years.
Live from the historic Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip, J.D. Salinger presents Hollywood stars and celebrities. What do they know? Do they know things? Let's find out!
Alright, here we go!
Thank you for joining the show, Jared Diamond. I haven't got any funny jokes or anything, so I'm just going to go straight into your book, so enjoy everyone. At over 400 pages long, I wouldn't be doing Guns, Germs and Steel any justice if I didn't say I recommend you picking up this book. Now, what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to summarise the book and the key points that I want for this video. Now, at first, Jared Taylor describes the migration of the human race. Funny enough, it is stated that 5 out of the 6 of all races originated in Africa, them being blacks, whites, African pygmies, Asians, and Koreans. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Jared does state that this is generalising groups, but for the sake of this video and for this book, it gives you a basic understanding. Now, these groups started to spread out all over the world, as seen from the image shown. And over the period of 1 million years, humans adapted to the different climates in the different parts of the world, and around about 10,000 BC had spread all over the world. After the quick history lesson, Jared then states the reasons for why some civilizations ended up being more advanced than others, and that surprisingly is rather more purely by circumstance, which I will now go and elaborate on. The first reason is rather obvious. As we've seen from the image earlier, the American continents were not reached until 14,000 BC, which was accessible from Serbia, and due to the lower sea levels at the time and the glaciers, it was actually accessible from Serbia over to that part of America. My geography is not amazing. Anyway, since this was the case, and it wasn't reached until 14,000 BC, Europe and Asia, however, were populated at 55,000 and 65,000 BC respectively. And although Africa had been populated and is known as the birthplace of the human race, there are reasons as to why it didn't end up becoming the most dominant civilization. The second factor, which will come up time and time again, is the advantageous area in a certain part of Asia. This area was known as the Fertile Crescent. If you look back to early religions, such as the Mesopotamians, and early civilizations, you'll see that most records point to this area as where humans started to advance. Now there are reasons for this. The Fertile Crescent, first off, had a rather diverse, climate. And it also has, as a result, had a lot of animals and a lot of crops. Funnily enough, these animals that were located in this area were also ones that we have tamed today, such as pigs, horses, and even sheep. Now, if you go back to Africa, you might say, well, hang on a minute, these people also have diverse animals, such as the zebra, lions, tigers, hyenas, and the species that existed in countries in Europe, e.g. England, which used to have a lot more diverse species. These species, however, even with the scientific advantages that we have today, are still not tameable. Sure, you have the animals in the zoo, but these animals aren't domesticated. They're tamed in the zoo, but when you breed a lion and it has an offspring, that lion is not automatically domesticated. Again, this one needs to learn up and it will learn from its parents. Yes, it's in the zoo, but these animals are not like your pet cat. You can't trust these animals. They're still at heart a wild animal. And so though you might be saying, well, hang on, how come if that was the case, then how come the Europeans had no trouble? Well, it turns out that quite a lot of the animals were sort of being tamed by all sorts of civilizations, as documented. And these documents are all over the world. And some of these species that eventually were not domesticated ended up either extinct or they're still wild today. Not only were there animals available, but there were also crops. Some of these crops you probably recognise today. In the Fertile Crescent alone, there were peas, lentils, chickpeas, soybeans, wheat, barley, millet, broom, and even rice. Now, if you were to compare this to an area such as New Guinea, the only cereals and other grasses that were available was the sugarcane. That's one domesticated crop to nearly 10. Due to this, you can clearly see that having 10 choices of crop compared to just one, you're going to end up with an advantage. The third factor, and also combined with the fourth factor, was the land mass and also the land axes. Now, if you take a look at this image of the map of the world, you will notice that there are clear differences between both the American continents and those from Europe and Asia. Although both continents are connected, there is a difference. One is clearly vertical, while the other is horizontal. Now you may be thinking, but what's the point? Well, Jared goes into reasons why this is so important. The way the planet climate works is the further you get away from the equator, the more diverse the weather patterns and seasons vary. So for instance, if you go further north, it will start getting colder, but not only that, it will also start to have different types of seasons. For example, in Christmas in the UK, it tends to be cold because that is our winter. Whereas if you go all the way down to a place such as Australia, they tend to spend their Australian Christmases at the beaches because it's their summer. And this is a good example of how the climates change. Now, if we were to go back and look at America, you can see that if we take, for example, Canada, it's known for its rather cold and snowy climate. Whereas if you would go all the way down to South America, in places such as Brazil and Peru, it's a rather hot and humid climate. Now, this plays a difference for not only migration, because if you were to go look at Europe and say, for instance, UK, and go all the way across to Japan, you can see that despite the differences in culture, their climate is rather similar. Now, of course, you do have a water landmass, but I'm just making the point of, since it is part of Asia, you can see how, despite the vast distance you'd have to travel to get from the UK to Japan, their climates are similar. Which means when migrating from places, such as Japan, all the way to the UK, the climate is rather similar, so people can quickly adapt. Bring that along with the food and the animals that are used to this climate, it's rather easy to populate these areas. Whereas where you were to go to somewhere such as Canada and bring crops that came all the way from Mexico, you're going to have trouble trying to get these crops who are used to similar to certain seasons that are vastly different further up north. Or if you're going from the south, you're heading, or if you're going from the north, you're going to head south. Again, you're going to have the same issue. Whereas the European and Asian nations had the advantage. Combine that along with the landmass, which again is greater in the Euro-Asian continents compared to that of the Americas, that also gives you more advantage to how many people you can have in a certain area. So how exactly did all these principles help? Well, we've already stated some reasons as above. First off, climate did make it easier for certain species of animals to go from one area to another. On top of that, it also helped with crop spreading. But it didn't just only do that. Due to the vast amount of animals, again in the Fertile Crescent, being domesticated, along with domesticating these animals, also came animal-like diseases. Now, if we take a rather common one that you've probably learned in school, such as cowpox, you'll know that come from cows and then it spread in the form of smallpox. And eventually we did come up with vaccines. Now, nations, of course, in the Euro-Asian atmosphere, because they were linked, spreading of diseases was rather easy. So that in a way could provide a disadvantage. So for instance, if we took the bubonic plague that originated, and most scientists say it began in Asian nations and then spread all the way over to the European, it killed over a quarter of the world's population at the time. But eventually the Black Plague died out, at least in that area, and it was only left in small pockets. But as a result, people either die from diseases or they live, they adapt, they build up an immunity to that disease. That's basic things. So now you've got all these diseases that have been in the Asian European areas, and people will start to adapt to them. But of course, if you were to introduce a disease that you've never come in contact with before and you get infected, you're not going to have the same immunity, which is exactly what happened when the Europeans went over from their old world to the new world in the Americas. And as a result, not that many people actually died from wars. About 99% of the American native Indian population actually died out due to diseases, not actually through war. Now, if we go back to the continent such as Africa, again you'll notice that it's vertical. And there were expansions in Africa. Of course, you have an advantage of being near the Fertile Crescent, as it was connected. And one of the most earliest and well-known civilizations was the Egyptians. And although it is argued that their language originated from Egyptians themselves, they were still one of the earliest civilizations. And again, they were in the Fertile Crescent. But if you were to take a successful African tribal sort of area, such as the Bantu, you'll see that they now populated most of the countries in the northern part of Africa and did go down. But it took many years due to the vast difference in climate. And eventually they were able to get down to a certain part of the south. And they nearly got to South Africa, but they sort of stopped at the Cape because there came a point where their crops and animals just couldn't take it, they couldn't survive, so they had to stop their expansion. Meanwhile, the nations such as Europe and Asia were advancing. Not only did they have access to now these crops and animals, but as a result, their population was rising. And clearly, law of averages, if you have more minds on certain things, they're more likely to be inventors or come up with cures for diseases or advances. And once a certain tribe or a certain amount of people get to that state, you no longer just need to have farmers. You can now, like I said, have scientists, teachers, and of course you've got more minds, more things, and this is why inventions. On top of that, due to the easy access from the Europeans to the Asian nations, they were able to spread inventions and ideas, and they either took the ideas, stole them from themselves, or looked at them, or some of them originated, but most ideas actually came from other nations and they were easily spread. Meanwhile, if you go back to the New World, there was a vast difference in climate, not as many people, and there were inventions such as the wheel, which was originated in different areas. And the New World did invent their version of the wheel, but you can see it's vastly different to that of the Old World due to the structures in it. But due to all these advantages, you can clearly see how nations started to become more advanced and had more practices. And this is what I liked the most about this book, since we're now going to the review part. This book fundamentally breaks down the view of superior races or superior genes and intellect, things like that, because it states rather it was circumstance, such as geography, climate, and available resources that resulted in certain civilizations being more powerful. So for instance, if you were to take the African people of Africa and put blacks and move them into Europe, and that's where they wanted, and the Europeans were in the south, you would find a nation today that was mostly, popularized by those in the African nations. There are examples of this, such as the Bantu people that I described earlier. They were responsible for wiping out, or at least the destruction in quite a lot of the black pygmy races. Again, this isn't a race crime, it was because they had superior technology due to their small advancement that they made in the African nations, and they either wiped you out, or you would become part of that tribe or that sort of civilization. And that's how the world's always worked. You either join them or you die. It's rather simple. But you're probably thinking, what happened to the people in the Fertile Crescent? Why aren't they the dominant threat today? If we actually look back at the Fertile Crescent, you'll notice that it's located in Syria and Israel, and also neighbouring near Egypt, which explains for Egypt's early advancement in civilization. However, the reason they aren't a superpower today is because they ended up being victims of their own circumstance. Due to having all the available crops and plants and animals in this area, they quickly took advantage of it. And at the time, the early Mesopotamians in that sort of area were the ones that ruled the land. And for quite a while they had wars and things. But once they started spreading these crops and things, they slowly started to lose this advantage. And due to so much of crops and burden and taking advantage of the environment, it ended up ruining it. Today, when we look at Egypt and areas that I've described earlier, we think of them as more of a desert land, and that is honestly because of human intervention. Before, it used to be a nice green area which was suitable for all these crops and these animals. However, what we see today is very different to what the place looked like even 2,000 years ago. Another thing you might be looking at, for those history buffs out there, is you're probably thinking, well, wasn't China a dominant force? And they were up until the 1400s. What happened there, though, is China's society throughout history has always been a rather collectivized one, and having links to the Communist Party. Now, I'm not going to get too political here, but with a thinking of collectivist mind, it has its advantages and disadvantages. One of those advantages was because it was united so early, it was one of the first languages ever created was in that area, and the empire was quite combined. You have famous scholars such as Confucius, all the way back thousands of years ago, coming up with what I described earlier as early politics. But the disadvantage of having a collectivized society as well is that you tend to think in one set of ways. So if one thing is forbidden, e.g. if we were to look at the British in the past, and it was a cultural thing, so in England they had oil lamps even though it was actually there was the light bulb out in America, and of course it put England at a disadvantage. The same can be said for China. There are many examples when they went back and they could have had a cultural advancement, but due to it conflicting with their culture, it couldn't be accepted. So this gave room for the Europeans to advance, as it was part of their ideology that they could take these things and they could start inventing. And that's where you have the different things, such as after the medieval period, you have the Enlightenment period. And as you know from before my other videos, that was where a lot of inspiration, art, devices, inventions, philosophy started coming about. And due to Europe's climate as well, being quite mountainous and separate, a lot of little mini nations occurred, and these small nations started fighting with each other. And if you look at any culture, even going all the way to New Guinea, you'll see that the dominant culture is normally the one that gets assimilated, is the one that normally ends up assimilating other cultures or destroying them. And so due to these smaller nations fighting with each other, they got stronger, they got bigger, they got more inventions, and then eventually you had the invention of guns, and this gave a big thing. So by the time they finally reached the New World, they had the huge advantage. And therefore, if we were to go back to the Fertile Crescent, they did have the crops and things, but at that point it doesn't matter anymore. Humans have become so advanced, it doesn't matter if you've got the crops, because the crops are anywhere. You've now got weapons, you've now got things to protect you with, you've got inventions, you've got lots of things, so it doesn't matter if you had that early head start anymore. Also, if we looked at a more advanced civilization, such as the Vikings, you'll notice that they were able to colonize certain places such as Greenland, and they were also the first people really to visit the New World, other than the natives, of course. However, certain civilizations that they started there didn't actually end up going so well for them. They either died out or they just disappeared. Now, of course, some of the nations did survive, such as Greenland, but if we were to go back in one situation, these Scandinavian countries weren't exactly, the biggest in terms of size, money, things like that. And so due to these issues, they couldn't keep carrying out trade ships. And as a result, the civilization, like I said, just disappeared. And they were either wiped out by the native Indians despite their advantages in such as, inventions, resources, things like that, because they weren't suited for that climate. They weren't used to it. They couldn't cover it. So it does show that, again, if we're looking at it from a race perspective, there isn't just the European race in this situation was wiped out. The Scandinavian race was wiped out in this situation, and the natives were able to conquer them. Again, it shows that race isn't actually a feature. It's more about determinism in that climate, the resources.
Well, that's our show. But before we go, I want to send out a quick message.
But yeah, that was Guns, Germs and Steel. If you're still sticking around, I thank you very much for watching this video, and I really do recommend reading the book. It was rather interesting piece of historic literature, and it even got me interested in agriculture of all things. And I thought it was boring, but it sticks with you the whole way through. It doesn't treat you like an idiot, but at the same time it doesn't it doesn't make things super complicated. As long as you're, understand, it's rather easy to understand. There's pictures, diagrams, all sorts of things in there to help you understand as the book goes on. And there's even some images that you can compare to different races and see how there was different things, and how there was it goes on a lot more about the Asian nations, and especially New Guinea, and how New Guinean people, despite having some advantages, they still were able to conquer all the little islands, and that's how you have similarities between them and some people you'll find in even Madagascar, and they're actually from Asian descendants rather than from African descendants. But that's enough yakking for me. If you liked the video, please leave a like and maybe even subscribe. And thank you very much, and hope to see you soon.